Doubling down on its efforts to use winter as a weapon, Russia launched its fiercest attack in weeks Thursday, battering Ukrainian power and water infrastructure amid freezing temperatures. Ukrainian military chief General Valery Zaluzhnyi said his forces shot down 54 of 69 missiles targeting energy facilities, but 10 pieces of critical infrastructure in 10 regions and 18 residential buildings were still damaged, authorities said. About 90% of Lviv, a western city far from the front lines, was left without electricity, its mayor said. Russia is trying to deprive Ukrainians of light before the new year. In his nightly video address to the nation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said most regions of Ukraine were experiencing power outages because of the latest Russian assault, especially Kyiv and the area around it, in addition to Lviv, Odessa, Kherson and other provinces. White House dismisses as unserious Kremlin's conditional willingness to discuss ending Ukraine war. Russian President Vladimir Putin oversaw the commissioning of new warships Thursday as part of his plan to boost the country's navy, which in April sustained the embarrassing loss of the Moskva missile cruiser. The new vessels included a corvette, a minesweeper and the nuclear submarine Generalissimus Suvorov. The Moskva, named after the Russian capital and the flagship of the country's Black Sea Fleet, was sunk by what Ukraine said were its anti-ship missiles. The Kremlin claimed that a fire that ignited munitions was the reason the ship went down. Russia unleashed a mass missile strike targeting 10 Ukrainian regions, wounding at least 5 civilians and hitting nearly a dozen critical infrastructure sites across the country, the State Emergency Service spokesman said at a briefing on December 29. Of 69 missiles fired by Russia, Ukraine's Air Force shot down 54, Chief Commander Valery Zaluzhnyi reported on Telegram. The mass strike hit 28 sites, of which 10 were critical infrastructure facilities, and the rest were residential buildings, Ukraine's State Emergency Service spokesman Oleksandr Karunzi said at a briefing. Russia's eighth mass attack involved air and sea-based cruise missiles and anti-aircraft guided missiles from the S-300 missile system launched from various directions, according to emerging reports. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said Russia's deadly attack is senseless barbarism, attacking peaceful Ukrainian cities ahead of New Year. Earlier in the morning, there were 4 hits in undisclosed infrastructure sites in Ukraine's second-largest city of Kharkiv, Syniehubov said. There were no casualties in Kharkiv, but some 1,000 households in the city remain without heating, he added. Immediately after the mass strike, 90% of Lviv was cut off from electricity, and 40% of Kyiv residents had no power. Belarus has allowed Russian troops to use its territory as a launchpad to attack Ukraine since February 24. The West has warned Minsk against helping to kill civilians in Ukraine. Russia attacked Ukraine with 16 Iranian-made Shahid drones overnight, Ukrainian officials said on Friday, a day after Moscow fired dozens of missiles in its latest barrage against critical infrastructure. A Reuters witness 20 kilometers (12 miles) south of Kyiv heard several explosions and the sound of anti-aircraft fire. By dawn, the attack appeared to be over and residents crept outside under peaceful skies after a relentless day and night of bombardment. Russia launched a total of 85 missile strikes, 35 airstrikes, and 63 strikes from multiple rocket launch systems in the past 24 hours, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said in its daily briefing on the war. The United States last week announced nearly $2 billion in additional military aid, including the Patriot air defense system, which offers protection against aircraft, cruise, and ballistic missiles. Britain said on Friday it has given Ukraine more than 1,000 metal detectors and 100 kits to deactivate bombs and to help clear minefields. Defense Minister Ben Wallace said on Thursday Britain would allocate £2.3 billion, $2.8 billion, to Ukraine in military aid in 2023, matching the amount it provided this year. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24 in what Putin calls a special military operation against what he says are threats to Russia's security. Ukraine and its Western allies call it an imperialist-style war of conquest. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed in cities laid to waste by Russian forces. Tens of thousands of troops have died on both sides. Ukraine said Friday it repelled a nighttime drone attack from Russia, a day after Moscow launched a new wave of missile strikes in the run-up to New Year's celebrations. The drone attack came after a barrage of Russian missiles battered Ukraine on Thursday morning, with blasts reported across the vast country, from the northeastern city of Kharkiv to the western city of Lviv near the Polish border. Ukraine's army said Russia had launched several dozen cruise missiles, the majority of which had been shot down. Russia has faced international condemnation and an onslaught of unprecedented sanctions over its war in Ukraine. The growing international isolation has forced President Vladimir Putin to seek to boost closer political and economic cooperation with nations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. A pariah in the West since the start of the assault on Ukraine, Putin on Friday spoke by video link with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, calling him a dear friend and hailing the two countries' efforts to counter Western pressure. Putin also said he was keen to ramp up military cooperation. Putin has also relied on the backing of Belarus's long-serving President Alexander Lukashenko, who allowed Russian troops to use his country as a launchpad for the Ukraine offensive. Kyiv has suggested it might have been part of a Russian ploy to try to draw Belarus into the conflict. According to information from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Ukrainian defenders have killed approximately 690 Russian invaders and destroyed 58 cruise missiles, 23 UAVs, 6 artillery systems and 12 armored combat vehicles over the past 24 hours. Ukraine's General Staff reported on December 30 that Russia had also lost 3,026 tanks, 6,059 armored fighting vehicles, 4,683 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2,010 artillery systems, 423 multiple launch rocket systems, 212 air defense systems, 283 airplanes, 268 helicopters, 1,740 drones, and 16 boats. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping vowed Friday to deepen their bilateral cooperation against the backdrop of Moscow's 10-month war in Ukraine, which weathered another night of drone and rocket attacks following a massive missile bombardment. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said in its Friday morning update that Russian forces had unleashed a total of 85 missiles and 35 airstrikes on Ukrainian targets in the previous 24 hours. Russia also launched 63 attacks from multiple launch rocket systems, the military report said. Some were aimed at Kyiv, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said Friday. Of 7 kamikaze drones launched against the Ukrainian capital, 2 were shot down on the approach to the city and 5 over Kyiv itself, according to Klitschko. Almost 30 Russian shells were fired at Marinets in Dnipropetrovsk province on Thursday night, according to Regional Governor Valentin Reznichenko. Marinets is located directly across the Dnieper River from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear power station. China, which has promised a no-limits friendship with Russia, has pointedly refused to criticize Moscow's actions in Ukraine, blaming the US and NATO for provoking the Kremlin, and has blasted the punishing sanctions imposed on Russia. Russia, in turn, has strongly backed China amid the tensions with the US over Taiwan. Russia and China are both facing domestic difficulties. Putin is trying to maintain domestic support for a war that has lasted longer than anticipated, while a surge in COVID-19 cases has overwhelmed hospitals in China.